Teyvat so far has 5 main cities accessible in-game. We're all familiar with them. They're where we go to rest, gather supplies, talk to Catherine, and a lot of the time we log off in them too. But how safe are they? Today, we're going to assess the defenses of each region's major city. The main things we're going to consider in these assessments are military power, location and terrain, architecture, and the outer perimeters of the cities in question. And just so we're clear, this is an assessment of how NPCs would handle these situations. We won't be taking vision holders into account. So, the city we're gonna start with is the very first one you come across in game. Mondstadt is a city that has been built on top of a tiny island that exists inside a lake. And now you might be thinking to yourself, oh wait, we're already off to a really great start. Since it's surrounded by water, it already has a defensive advantage. Right? About that. See, we're all familiar with moats. Their whole point is making the castles of a wall inaccessible by either surrounding them with a large ditch or deep water, meaning the only way to enter is via a bridge. A bridge that was almost always a drawbridge as well. This city does in fact not have that. There is absolutely no tactical advantage to having a stone bridge here. A wooden bridge would have been better as it could have at least been destroyed, stopping potential attackers. See, it would have potentially been fine if the castle walls were directly attached to the stone bridge, but they're not, meaning even if the city itself is blocked off to invaders, they're still able to cross this bridge onto a fairly wide chunk of land, giving them enough room to bring siege weapons, ladders to get directly to the city. Ideally, you would want the walls directly attached to the bridge. Similarly, the Motte and Bailey would be built on a mound and surrounded by water at the same time, so that's 2 extra obstacles for enemies to get through. Mondstadt City though has none of these things. They already had a unique geographical advantage in being an island. They just didn't capitalize on it. There are 2 access points to the city. The main entrance is fine. If we disregard all previous issues, at least it has a portcullis. This side entrance doesn't even have that. Some monsters could easily just walk right in. There's nothing blocking this side. The walls themselves are just, well, look for yourselves. If I go all around the perimeter to assess them, first off, there's almost no doors, so where are the walls even accessed from? You've got a few doors here, but again, there's no actual indication of how you get there from down below. Just look at this. What is going on here? This is an integral part of the wall, right at the main entrance. How exactly are soldiers and bow users supposed to access it? For Mondstadt, I counted a total of knights in the city. The biggest issue of this aspect being that there's only one type of military personnel and they all use swords. Mondstadt also has practically no defenses outside of the city, so they very likely wouldn't see an incoming attack until it was too late and be unprepared as a result. All it would really take is for the surrounding camps of Hilichurls and Abyss Order to team up and they could easily storm the city. Moving on to Liyue Harbour. Now it may not have walls like Mondstadt, but I think that far from discredits it here, as Liyue has its own distinct advantages, and I would argue that by far the biggest one is its location and geography. So what Liyue lacks in having walls, it more than makes up for by being surrounded by mountains. There are 3 access points to the city, the first one being the route from Mondstadt and the inn. It's also worth noting here the importance of towers and guard placement, so not only does it keep the area maintained, but if there were to be a huge horde of monsters headed for the city this way, the guards would be able to alert them in advance. Now the other 2 are a bit more difficult since they lack any guards or patrols, though from this side at least there are guards at the chasm, which might I add also hosts a whole load of enemies, so if they were to ever come from this direction the city would know. And of course there is the Jade Chamber. I mean, I'm sure they have binoculars, right? Just probably best not to drop the Jade Chamber right near the city. And from this side traversal would be extremely difficult too. You've got ruins here and here and mountains scattered all over that would take up a lot of time to travel through. The one thing that could serve as an advantage to enemies is if they were able to climb on top of these mountains and cliffs, they would have the high ground. We already do have some along these parts, and there is a considerable amount of Hilichurl archers in this region too, but I don't think it's realistically feasible to expect if we're talking huge numbers of them. Most of the Hilichurl population is also on this side, so they have a huge mountain to tackle first before ever getting close to the city, and there is also the ballista along here. The main enemy concern would actually most likely be treasure hoarders, especially since there are a lot in this area. But if an army of treasure hoarders did come through here, the Golden Houses section of guards could flank them. But overall, these are some great choke points and bottlenecks for incoming enemies. And moreover, if it really came down to it, blowing up the mountaintops would serve as natural walls. I would argue the harbour side is safe, assuming Osayo doesn't have any kids either. Mind you, I'm not exactly sure how the impact of the Jade Chamber hitting Osayo and the water wouldn't have caused a flood to hit the harbour, but... And while NPCs do acknowledge the existence of sea monsters, we have yet to see any in-game, so I'm gonna exclude them as a possibility for now. Another issue is that they only have one weapon type, just like Mondstadt, but on the plus side, Liyue does have technology. The region always seems to come across as having the most competent army, which we see addressed also in the Mutual Security Enhancing event. They clearly have very strict training for soldiers. To have such strong military might, these soldiers must be drinking their Gamersups. What's that, Paimon? They're drinking the lean flavor energy drink from Gamersups that's keto friendly and zero sugar? You heard that right. We are officially partnered with Gamersups, an energy drink with a whole load of flavors to choose from. My personal current favorite is lean, and well, I think it's safe to say these guys like it too. What? You want some as well, Paimon? Well, sure. Just use the link in the description down below, gamersups.gg/brevity to get 10% off your order. Now, where were we? In terms of how easy it would be for an invasion force to overwhelm Liyue Harbour, I would say it's certainly a lot harder than Mondstadt. The terrain is a huge advantage for the city, and they have a large number of guards. The mountains leave little room for monsters or other enemies to get through, aside from the 3 very small choke points, of which Liyue is quite well prepared for. So overall, pretty safe. Narukami Island has the least amount of enemies compared to these other islands. Oh my Archon, Inazuma is actually just uninhabitable. The main enemies here though are samurai, so those would be what the city is most likely to be up against in the event of an attack. But Nobushi don't have a clear advantage like some other enemies would, such as abyss mages or samuchels that can attack from a distance. However, assuming, since these are samurai that were most probably once members of Inazuma's army, they could have knowledge on the inner workings of it, such as attack patterns and strategies they use. We have also seen that these enemy groups can and do team up, so it's certainly possible that the samurai, treasure hoarders, and Fatui could all come together to attack the city. Now, most Nobushi don't use elements, aside from these two, but the Fatui, they have delusions, and the maidens can attack from a distance. So maidens in the rear and heavy hitters up front, this would certainly make them all the more formidable. Since Inazuma is made up of islands, this already lends itself a huge advantage, as any enemies invading from the other islands would really be out in the open and vulnerable on water. This is also assuming the monsters even know how to use boats. If anyone has any proof of this, do let me know. This does also at the same time though mean that soldier backup from the Kujo encampment would face similar issues and be easily shot down by enemies already on Narukami Island, and even if they're not, it would take them a while to get there all the same. Now we get to the city itself. The main area is devoid of enemies, so generally safe, and it only has one entrance, so allows for a choke point with approaching enemies, but its defenses are rather poor. Let's take a look at the landscape of the city and its choice of architecture. So the issue with Inazuma City are these weak points here. There's no defensive wall, and these parts are easily climbable. This side is also particularly concerning. Enemies could sneak through and around to the upper city. These stairs aren't too much of a problem though, as they can just be destroyed in the event of an attack. I do think Inazuma does the whole castle thing a lot better than Mondstadt, better incorporating its surrounding landscape. From the outside it seems very impenetrable, and being high up on a cliff would make knocking enemies down rather easy. And if it came to it, since the bridge leading up to it is made of wood, it could be burned down and used as refuge for the NPCs. The downsides though are that it would probably end up a war of attrition, and the remaining resources within the castle walls would eventually run out. And since most Japanese castles are constructed primarily of wood, it would be easily destroyed. Inazuma City does also have the advantage of Rito Island with additional soldiers. So say in a theoretical attack, you had samurai, monsters, whatever enemies laying siege to the capital city. Rito Island soldiers could come up as reinforcements from behind and flank them, catching them by surprise. And after going around and assessing the city, the total head count of guards is Inazuma City overall has many distinct advantages, much like Liyue, that make it easier to defend against enemies, terrain, soldier location, layout of the city, but if they were to be overwhelmed by an enemy force, the city would most certainly be doomed. Now, how well would Sumeru's city fare? It's a tree. Next region. Oh, okay. Let's give Sumeru a fair chance. So first off, we'll start with how easy it is to access the city. There are some pros to Sumeru City's location and terrain. Similar to Mondstadt and Inazuma, it's situated on an elevated piece of land, with only 2 entrances that must be accessed by bridge. Using the river is not a viable way of accessing the city as an enemy. It's small, narrow, and you'll be easily spotted, so that's off the table. The back entrance is somewhat difficult to access with a tiny bridge connecting it, and it's not particularly developed compared to the other side. It also has barely any forces placed here, so super vulnerable. The front entrance comes with its own unique problems. We've got a large and wide bridge that would be a lot easier for enemies to traverse, and probably would not be possible to destroy fast enough. And while they've got a bit of a wall... oh, no, they do not have a wall. 0 defenses. An enemy could easily get through to the city from all sides and corner the soldiers. The design of Sumeru City is just an absolute mess. Just looking at the architecture, I would say physics is practically non-existent here. It is important to point out though, the jungle is much more difficult to traverse compared to, say, Mondstadt's land, so that would put enemies at a disadvantage, and allow for Sumeru's soldiers to both prepare and cut them off within the jungle itself. This is where the forest rangers could play a big role. They are definitely a big asset for Sumeru. Though this group's primary job is looking after the forest, it is also protection of civilians, and the main advantage they have is being able to spot enemies from a distance and using Sumeru's huge trees to attack enemies below, assuming that most are probably trained to use bows. Sumeru, like Liyue, also has watchtowers that would potentially help spot enemies, though none of them seem to be actively used. As far as enemies are concerned, the biggest threat Sumeru would most likely face is Eremites. They make up a very large portion of Sumeru's population, and well, we can see just how many exist in the region as an enemy type. I would say this is the most likely entrance that Eremites would use, considering most exist in this part of the jungle and desert. Now, this isn't just the fact that Sumeru is absolutely filled to the brim with this enemy group, it's also just how many types there are. You've got the low tier common enemy Eremites, but then they start gaining elemental powers too, until you reach the elite ones that can literally summon spirits. Can you just imagine the amount of damage that could be done by the Lore Master? All they would need to do is summon a scorpion and set fire to the tree. Not to mention the Gale Hunters can summon birds that can attack soldiers from below. And of everything, the tree is of course the largest issue here, way too big to ignore. Literally. While building your city on and around a tree is a cool concept and all, the practicality of it is non-existent. We do get a commission that sheds a bit more light on the tree as well. This NPC says it herself. If anything were to happen to the tree, the city would be done for. And like she said, a most probable outcome is that the tree and its branches fall, crushing the entire city underneath it. What particularly bugs me about this quest though is that it never acknowledges anything aside from bugs and fungus. These could definitely be a problem, but I think the more immediate one is enemies like this and this. See, an enemy wouldn't even need to enter the city. It could just go where these Samachels are, for instance, bring a group along that use pyro, and bam. I mean, there's just so many ways that this could backfire on them, really. Sumeru also doesn't have dedicated departments the way Liyue's Milleleft do. A branch being made up of entirely mercenaries is always going to have disadvantages. Lack of organization, training and skill, and a relaxed environment, compared to Liyue, where it's stated that they have very strict assessment standards. Sumeru is the only city where we see the guards using multiple weapon types though. Sumeru City's defenses, they need a lot of work. As it stands now, the military is a mess. There's huge amounts of enemies in the region, and the city's design overall does not benefit it in the slightest. Maybe Fontaine will prove to be a bit safer. Okay, so hear me out. Fontaine's main city might actually be super safe from enemies, like almost impenetrable. But this sort of city design almost always has benefits and drawbacks to it. So similar to Inazuma, Fontaine is made up of islands, already making it much harder to access the city. The city itself is surrounded by really high walls that, while not built like Mondstadts are probably high enough that it would be difficult for enemies to shoot at soldiers from down below. But again, just like with Sumeru, the court of Fontaine is built more as a spectacle for the player than having much immediate sense put into the architecture. You definitely see this when you begin to take a closer look. One attack or blast to these buildings here, for example, or any of these, what I assume are pipes, and they would collapse, causing damage all over the city. All this to say that the city has a lot of weak points, but the plus side is that it's difficult to access, so not super likely to happen. So given how the city is built high off the ground and with big impenetrable walls on all sides, the only ways in and out are through the aquabus lines. Well, there is this trade entrance, but it's not even clear where this goes, and this sneaky side entrance, but again, if you're bringing a sizable force of enemies or monsters, it is not worth going this way. The entrance to the city from the Institute aquabus line probably would have been quite vulnerable and open to attack were it not for being destroyed, making it now impossible to access the city through here. This leaves only two options. Romaritime Harbour is only accessible either from below the waterfall or the route itself, since it's high above ground, so an almost impossible route for enemies to gain access to, aside from perhaps here if they were to drop down. The Navia line, on the other hand, looking at enemies, Fontaine's biggest concern largely lies with out of control mechs potentially running wild, or an alarmingly large hilichurl population over in this region. See, the Navia line is where Fontaine is arguably the most exposed. This is the only aquabus line directly connected to land, so it's at risk of being overrun with treasure hoarders, mechs, and hilichurls. If the hilichurls from Irenes Forest and this ginormous camp over here teamed up, they could quite easily head straight through here and here and get directly to Marcotte Station, and since there's practically no guards there, just head straight on into the city. The headcount for Fontaine City's military personnel is so there's barely any personnel to defend the city either, which is also addressed in the security event, where it's said that members all have to be trained to super high standards and that maintenance can take a really long time, meaning it's really hard to have huge troop numbers. So military is another issue in its own right here, because for all its strides in technology, we've seen just how much it's backfired on Fontaine. The Fontaine army is heavily reliant on mechs, but being the most technologically advanced means they do have guns, so can attack from a distance, and we see in the security event that they have developed the tactic of volley fire. For Fontaine, its biggest advantage is that it's almost impossible to access, mostly making up for any downsides it has, such as military size or architectural stability, so much safer and easily defendable compared to Sumeru at least. So, as far as rankings go after this assessment, Liyue Harbour comes first as the safest city in Teyvat, Fontaine a close second, Inazuma faring well in third place, Mondstadt barely making the rankings in fourth, and Sumeru right down there. The only city that I would 100% not want to be in, on the chance enemies do attack, would be Sumeru. I am not going anywhere near that tree. Oh, but Sumeru does have a lot of grass.